All right, well, first of all, I want to thank you so much, Mr. McGill, for taking time. I know you're very busy at the conference, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
Yeah, this is certainly my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, you're welcome. Mr. McGill, I wonder if we could start by talking about your work that you currently do. You currently are the program officer for the Southern Office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Could you tell me what those responsibilities entail and kind of what your work does?
Yes. The information contained on my business card does state indeed that title. But that title now, within the last few months, have changed to a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the National Trust is changing our way of doing business. We're still ultimately concerned with saving historic buildings. We'll always do that, but we're taking a different approach. We're assigning national treasures. We have a list, and places go onto this list, and they are titled national treasures. What we want this list to be is a living and breathing list where we put places on this list, places that are threatened, and we dedicate resources to these places, and we assign teams to eliminate the threat to these places, and hopefully within 2 years or less we can move these, eliminate the threat, take these places off the list and add others. Okay. So again, it's a living and breathing list of places that are threatened, historic
what would
places.
Be some examples of
some of those places currently that are threatened is Charleston, South Carolina, in the sense that Charleston, South Carolina is now entertaining the tour boat industry, cruise ship industry, and it's placed on this list of national treasures not trying to eliminate the existence of these tour boats, but control them in a way that will not harm the historic fabric of the city of Charleston, will not harm the viewshed that exists. Tour boats or cruise ships are huge, and when they dock in the city, it overtakes the skyline. The buildings in Charleston, South Carolina, are not very tall. So when that cruise ship is there, that's what you see. That's what it's focused on. And you've got the existence of people getting off of those boats and surging into the city and doing what they do when they're in the city, which is a good thing. We want that. But we want to control it. Charleston is a city that is a good mixture of living space and commercial space. So the city of Charleston has been in pretty good control of all that, mixing the two. But to all of a sudden have tour boats or cruise boats mixed into all that.
That's a lot of people getting off the boat.
It is, and Charleston is on a peninsula, so that means that the space is very limited. In placing Charleston on this list, again, it's not an attempt to stop the cruise ships from coming, but just a matter of trying to control it. If we know that there's going to be 2 cruise ships a week and it's not going to be no more, then that's fine. But the way it is now, those numbers could increase, and there's no control on how many it can increase to. So that's why Charleston, South Carolina is on that list. Other places on the list is the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project during World War II, of course, the end product of that was the atomic bomb. But to get to that product, that atomic bomb, there were places where in various states, New Mexico, in Tennessee, where those places existed that created that bomb, in the eventual, and Washington State. And there are places that still exist that could help tell that story of how this came about. And those places are threatened right now. So the Manhattan Project is on the list because we want to save these buildings to help tell that story. Okay. One place that I'm directly involved with is the Mississippi Delta. The Mississippi Delta has made the list because it has just been proclaimed a National Heritage Area. And what my role is in all this is going in and making sure we're creating a management plan. We have a team of folks creating a management plan. And my specific role in helping to create this management plan is I bring to the table a museum background, an interpretive background. So I have to collect all those stories, all those themes that will help tell the story that this management plan or this heritage area will tell. We want tourists, we want people to be interested in visiting the heritage area. But when they visit the heritage area, we got to make sure that all that it has to offer is indeed offered, and the entities offering have the capacity to accommodate these people once they get there, because we want these visitors by word of mouth to tell others that visit the Mississippi Delta. There we know the blues exists there. You can go and experience the blues. You can learn about the story of Mr. Johnson selling his soul to the devil. Right. You can learn about Jim Henson and the creation of the Muppets. He's from that area, but we cannot neglect those other stories. The story of Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And
so
Emmett
it's really
Till.
about storytelling.
And Emmett Till. We certainly cannot neglect the fact that that's where he was killed. Right. This native Chicagoan, this young teenager going in and paying a compliment to a white woman in the late 50s and was killed for it. And that's part of the American story. Although a sad part of American story, it's part of the story nonetheless. And we need to tell that. So it's my role to make sure that that is included in this management plan. And again, as you said, it is about storytelling.
Well, it's and I want to talk to you even after the interview, because this is very exciting, because in the University of Florida Oral History program, every fall, I take a group of usually about 12 to 14 students to the Delta, and we do oral history interviews. And we've been doing this for 5 years. And we work with people in Cleveland and in Indianola. We do a yearly symposium, the Civil Rights History of Delta State. And in fact, this year, our symposium is Wednesday, September 19th. So I can give you all that information about, we've done about 110 oral history interviews or students, and we can give you those interviews if they would be helpful in your work. Last year, we were there for the reopening of the Emmett Till Museum in Glendora.
Well, see, it's fate that we're doing this. Yeah. It's certainly fate that because my next trip to the Delta is next month. Okay. And I have a series of interviews that I have to do with stakeholders. Okay. But it appears to me that you have done a lot of the work that I will be doing, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Okay. And what you have done is valuable to what we're trying to accomplish with this management plan. Okay. My other direct assignment is working with Sweet Auburn in Atlanta. The community in Atlanta where Martin Luther King Jr. grew up, it's threatened. It's threatened because the commercial district is in need of revitalization. It threatens. The threat is that it could cease to exist because some of the buildings have been torn down. Some of the buildings have been acquired, but some of the current owners do not have a sense of preservation. A lot of times they acquire these buildings with the intent of tearing them down. And we don't discourage acquisition of these buildings. What we try to encourage is development within the context of what already exists.
Right.
You shouldn't acquire with the intent of tearing down a nice modest building and putting a high rise in its
Right.
place, because you got to think about what's around it, what's surrounding in the surrounding area, and hopefully keep it within the context of what's already there. So that's the threat to Sweet Auburn, and I'm directly involved in that. In fact, I'm heading up that project, so it is my responsibility to make sure that this Sweet Auburn district continue to exist as it currently exists. So that's going to be quite a task.
That is a big task. Mr. McGill, I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling me about this fascinating project that you've been working on. It seems like many years, the slave dwelling project. Can you tell me how you started that and how you kind of got involved?
Well, the slave dwelling project, with being an employee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and assisting people in saving places, it would usually be those iconic places, the house on the hill, if you will, those places that
Right.
celebrate our heroes, those heroes usually being white males. It left very little room or appreciation for the smaller buildings, the outbuildings, for example, a plantation building, the concentration would be on the main house. Very seldom the outbuildings, which of course consist of the slave cabins. And if you take an urban setting in a historic city, and what the Chamber of Commerce or the tourism business would concentrate on, it would be the nice houses that would front the street, the nice mansions within the city limits. But very seldom would they concentrate on those outbuildings behind those nice mansions. That's a tourist draw, and they would concentrate on the architectural significance of those places. So, in helping people save places like that, I would see the voids every day in that, the flaws every day in that. And there's nothing wrong with trying to save those places. They need to be saved. They have a story to tell.
Sure.
But I think equally as important to that are those outbuildings, because in those outbuildings, in those dwellings behind it, live the people that are my ancestors, the people that were the vein of my existence. But in telling the American story, a lot of times we tend to overlook that part of the story for various reasons. And noticing that void, one could, get mad or try to do something about it.
Right.
And what I decided to do about it was create the Slave Dwelling Project. And what it involved is seeking those places that still exist, those dwellings that still exist where slaves once inhabited, and asking permission to spend the night there. And in doing that, it would bring attention to them, and it has been. My intent was to stay within the boundaries of the state of South Carolina because, this is a personal quest of mine.
Yeah.
And I knew that I had the resources to, travel throughout the state and spend the night. And it started out that way. And it got so popular that, I started to become the clearinghouse for places like that. I would get these phone calls saying that, I know this place, what you're doing is great. And most of the calls were like that. There were some negatives out there saying that, why open that wound, that sleeping dog's life? But that was, that was in the minority.
Okay.
That was probably about 2% of the feedback. 98% was quite encouraging. But then there were those calls that would say, well, I know of this place. Can you come here? Can you come here? And when I explained that it was a personal project, they had to put forth the resources to make it happen. They did.
Wow.
So since 2010, I've slept in 36 dwellings throughout the United States, to include 2 northern states, Pennsylvania and Connecticut. Because a lot of times when we think about the institution of slavery, we tend to give the North a pass, and we should not, because slavery existed there also. I'm currently working on the 2013 calendar, and I got a lot of good prospects that I'm considering to put on that calendar. It's been working pretty well. You know, the attention is there. And what I'm also doing when I go there, I insist, once we book the place, I insist that they do a public program of sorts, and that is working. You know, we invite the public to come and attend these lectures that I give, and it's been working pretty well.
Do you remember the first stay, the first night? What was that like? What went into that? The
first stay actually happened long before 2010. It happened, I think, right around 1999. And I was a part of a History Channel documentary called The Unfinished Civil War. I'm also a Civil War reenactor. And the gentleman doing the documentary was following 2 Civil War reenactors to try to figure out what made us tick, because some of us are kind of out there, and some folks might say that I'm kind of out there as a reenactor. But I was the subject of the Union. I was the Union reenactor that was being followed doing this documentary, and then there was a Confederate reenactor. They were doing the same with him. So the director was looking for a little more content for his documentary, a little more oomph. So I gave him that idea. I told him about the idea I had about spending a night in a slave cabin. He thought it was great, so we made arrangements for my first day at Boone Hall Plantation in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And we went in that night. The crew followed me in and filmed it all, and they filmed me kind of preparing my space. And of course, they left me all alone in that space. But the most interesting thing about that night in that slave cabin was about 3 a.m. I woke up to the sounds of dogs barking in the background, way off in the background. And then I thought, you know, if this was that time of slavery, it's a good chance that it could have been slaves trying to escape and being chased by dogs. So that was the most interesting thing about that first night. But the more recent stays since 2010, about half the times I've been alone. But the other half, you know, I always invite folks to share the experience with me, and people have been taking me up on it. Now, some folks say yes, and then come time to do it, they just can't muster the courage, you know, to do it. I had a situation in Louisiana, Evergreen Plantation, where about 30 or so people were supposed to share that experience with me, because on this property they have 23 slave cabins still left, which is quite amazing. And again, about 30 folks were supposed to spend the night with me. But when it came time to actually make it happen, as we walked into the slave village where the cabins were, the numbers steadily decreased because the folks couldn't handle it. They just weren't prepared. You know, it sounded good and it looked good on paper. It sounded like a great idea. But as the farther we walked into the places where we were supposed to sleep that night, the numbers decreased, and folks said, no, they just packed up and got in their cars and went home. So it's still a lot for some folks.
Yeah, it's very emotional. I mean, is Evergreen Plantation, is that a private plantation?
Evergreen Plantation is private. Edgard, Louisiana. In fact, the film that's just been recently released, Lincoln vampire
Right.
hunter. Some of that was filmed there.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Mandingo from years
Oh,
back.
yeah, that was early 70s, yeah.
That was filmed there.
Okay, that's so fascinating. Because I'm trying to remember, I took a group of students to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. It was an alternative spring break. And we did a tour of a plantation. It was not that far north of New Orleans. It was privately owned. And it was really striking because it had a whole village, about 20. I'm trying to think if it was the same one.
It's probably, if it was that many slave cabins, it's probably evergreen. Now the plantation house itself, the stairs are out in front are kind of circular.
That's it. That was evergreen.
Yes, that's evergreen plantation. Yeah. Yes.
And it was interesting. I'll never forget this because there was a docent there, but she reiterated several times, this is a private plantation. And so when we got out to the slave village, she said, you take over the tour back here and you can say whatever you want to your students. And I was like in heaven because I've been to many slave plantations and it's so heavily scripted what people say, And she said, this is a private, we're not under any, there's no surveillance of what I'm saying or what you're saying, just put it all out there. I said, oh my gosh, it was incredible.
Well, you bring up a good point because there are a lot of folks and entities that are afraid of the subject, are very afraid of the subject. So some choose to stay away from it and not say anything. And then there are some that are so afraid of, they might say the wrong thing and they dance around it or sugarcoat it. And to me, that's just as bad.
Yeah.
Now I've been to places, Hopsweed Plantation in Georgetown County, for instance. I think I've got the best story from an interpreter. And then she was a white elderly, not elderly, maybe senior.
Okay.
And she did the best job. I mean, she didn't hold back anything about the slavery that existed there, and she just did a beautiful job. So, if I can hold her up as an example for others, I think everybody should go there and listen to her interpretation. So that was a good thing to experience that.
Wow. What does it mean for you to be here at this conference of the National Underground Railroad? I mean, what have you experienced so far? What have been some of the memorable?
Well, I'm lucky to be here because what I proposed to do while I was here was to be a presenter on this very subject, the slave dwelling project. It was not chosen as a presentation, but it was indeed chosen as an exhibit. Okay. And that's good because I think I get to interact with more people
Probably
this
more
way.
People, yeah.
And I got to understand, I represent what the people were running from, not necessarily a stop along the way, which is, of course, what the Underground Railroad is about. So to come here and to share with anyone who comes by to interact with me this project is a good thing, and it's been going over well. And there are some folks who have been helping me to identify potential places that I need to make contact with. So that's all good. Now, I was a little disappointed because when I found out I was coming here, I put out my feelers to try to find places in St. Augustine to, instead of the sleeping here in a nice comfortable bed, I wanted to go to St. Augustine somewhere and sleep in a former slave dwelling. And I said, I know that the oldest city in this continental U.S., there's got to be places like that. But I didn't find any. Obviously, I was communicating with the wrong folks. Well, that may be a little harsh, but I didn't get the information that I was seeking. I was hoping that I could be laying my head in a slave dwelling here in St. Augustine.
Well, and that's another thing we can, after the interview or at any point, we should be in contact because if you come back to Florida at any point, I think we can maybe the oral history program can put you in contact with individuals. But I think you have found in your professional work what we experience here in Florida quite often is a denial or an attempt to try to maybe sweep things under a rug, so to speak.
And that's true, because when I stayed in Texas, in 2010, I addressed an audience at the National Preservation Conference in Austin, and at that point the project was in its infancy. But there was someone in that audience that thought that I was worthy of coming back and addressing their statewide conference on this subject matter. But not only did they want me to address their statewide conference as their keynote speaker, they wanted to find as many dwellings for me to stay in to accompany this presentation I was going to give.
Okay.
And I said, yeah, I'm in, but let me warn you, you're going to have a hard time, finding these places. This is a statewide preservation organization. They said, oh, no, we'll find plenty. We'll find plenty. So, and I'd get these phone calls, and they'd be discouraged. Oh, we haven't found one yet. You were right. But they did find two. And I did stay in those two places. But that addresses your point. There is still that denial. And there, although there might be some that still exist, there are a lot more that don't, and for various reasons they don't. They weren't made of the best material to start with, and there's the issue of having to pay tax on a place that you don't use, and some folks tear them down for that reason. There's demolition by neglect. But now, what's not excusable to me, in my mind, is getting rid of them, trying to erase that part of our history. That's unforgivable from where I sit. But so factor in all that. It's a challenge finding these places. But to help find more places, we have to factor in urban slavery. And when we factor in urban slavery, that increases the number of places that still exist, because a lot of places that now we call a guest house, carriage house, it might be a garage or whatever, a storage area or whatever it's being used for now, it chances are historically it started out as a slave dwelling. So as folks ask me, well, how many do you think there are? I said, I don't know, because you got to factor in the urban slavery. Yeah, and that just increases the number immensely.
Well, it kind of reminds me of when I was in graduate school. I remember reading Sterling Stuckey, and Professor Stuckey he made a point which you have just illustrated, which is that slavery was just as important of an institution in the North, before the 1840s, and that there were so many aspects of African American culture in the North that people have ignored because they always assumed that it was always all down south, right? And in fact, he started in Philadelphia. He said, if you want to understand African, what then were called Africanisms, African culture in the Americas, he said ground zero is Philadelphia. You start there. And he, of course, a lot of people said, well, what are you talking about? And you have to go to the South. But it's interesting.
Yes, you are correct there. The place I stayed in Philadelphia, Cliveden, which is a National Trust site. They recently, and the reason they invited me up there was because they recently came across papers of the original owner, the Chew, Mr. Chew, and the house was built in the 1770s. And Mr. Chew was quite prominent. He was a judge, but he also owned slaves in the South. So from 1770 to the time that the Civil War started, of course, Mr. Chew was long dead, but his descendants still owned that house, and they still owned slaves. So the Civil War started, they were kind of playing it both ways. Okay. Here there are Northerners, but there are plantations here in Maryland. So going back to your point, the North does not get a pass. The place I stayed in Connecticut, the Bush Holly House, this gentleman was an entrepreneur, and he was in the shipping business, cargo, within inland shipping. But he needed labor to support that his way of doing business, and that labor was indeed slave labor. So there up north it existed. So, and I went to Portland, Maine. And at the time that I was visiting Portland, Maine, the project again was in its infancy, and I was introduced to a resident of Portland, Maine, and I told her about the project, and I said, well, I want to come up here and find a place here. And her first response to me was, there are no such places here. So now she just threw out the gauntlet because no. Maine was not one of the original colonies. No, it wasn't. But it was a territory at one point. And it wasn't when it existed as a territory, slavery existed there. And it was part of the Missouri Compromise. Maine, a part of the Missouri Compromise.
Right.
And with that, slavery existed there. And Portland itself was on the coast. The shipping was done there.
Yeah.
Labor was needed to support that industry. That labor was slave labor. Slavery existed there. So there are buildings there, I know, that support that. So again, she threw out the gauntlet. So yeah. I accept that challenge.
Right. Mr. McGill, I wonder if you could talk, you mentioned earlier about your work in Civil War reenactment. And most people know very little about this. I can tell you one brief anecdote from Florida. This is a Florida story. One of my graduate students has worked for many years in the summers of the National Park Service. And she said that whenever they do battlefield reenactments, they have, hundreds of people will volunteer to be Confederate reenactors, but they actually have to pay people to be United States troops reenactors. They actually have to, I can't remember if she said $10 an hour or something, but she said it's so hard to find people to be. But I wonder if you could tell me about what got you interested initially into becoming a reenactor?
Me becoming a Civil War reenactor was a challenge because I used to be a park ranger at Fort Sumter, of course, where the Civil War started. And being a park ranger, I would constantly come in contact with Confederate reenactors. And I would look at these guys and I resented them. I mean, I would look at them with resentment because I'm saying you guys are memorializing a part of history that was not good to my folks. And you're trying to keep all that alive. But then some of these guys I got to know as individuals. And I saw that, these guys are pretty sincere and they're honoring their ancestors just as I have the desire to honor my ancestors. And then I started to do a little research. Of course, being a park ranger, you have to do that research because you want to try to tell the whole story. And then Movie Glory came out. But even before all that, some of these Confederate reenactors were trying to convince me to become a reenactor. But they wanted me to be a Confederate reenactor.
Okay.
And I said, oh, no way. But then the movie Glory came out, and I started doing a little more research around that movie and that particular group. And, of course, being there where that activity happened on Morris Island, right across from Fort Sumter, where I work every day, and I can look across and see that island. Yeah. I thought this reenactment thing had some relevance. So I started the group in Charleston, and it came with a challenge. Just as I told you, when I started the slave dwelling project, I got that 2% negative. Yeah. Well, the negative was a little higher percentage, okay. In Charleston, South Carolina, starting a union group and a black union group, at that. And there was some negative, but even that was still minor to the positives feedback that I got. So all that factored in to me becoming a Civil War reenactor. But what I learned in being a reenactor was, just as you're studying what motivated those black men to become a reenactor, you gotta study also what motivated those Confederates, right? To do what they did. So reading Johnny Reb and Billy Yank was a part of of what I did to prepare myself to be a reenactor. And when I became a reenactor, I had to communicate and interact with those Confederate reenactors more because, they had the experience of physically doing what I was doing. There's a lot of safety matters involved with being a reenactor. You just can't, pick up a functional musket and go play war. There's some things you have to learn. And there was it was the Confederate reenactors that got me there, got me that knowledge I needed. I would fall into their formation. Of course, I'd be in a Union uniform or no uniform at all in their formation, just to learn the safety of being a Civil War reenactor.
Right.
So learning these guys as individuals and gaining their trust and vice versa was an important part. But now, even with that, there's still some today I wouldn't want to hang out with because there are still some that are in my opinion in it for the wrong reason, trying to change the outcome of the war. But for the most part, I get along with most of the Confederate reenactors, and we developed a mutual understanding that the story I'm telling is just as important as the story you're trying to tell.
Well, and they need you to fight the war.
Yeah.
You need an adversary.
Yes,
right?
yes. So. That's how it works, because we want the audience to have a good outcome. Right. Whatever the audience believes.
Exactly. You got to provide the drama of battle and
yeah.
Wow, that's really fascinating. We had just started. I'm sure you're familiar with the Battle of Olustee reenactments here, but
and I used to participate in that early on.
Okay, so you went down. Okay, and that was to me very. When I first learned about that, when I was a graduate student, and coming across records of some of the African American Union soldiers who were tortured and executed, right on the day of the battle. I mean, that's powerful.
Yeah, not given that opportunity even to become a prisoner of war.
Yeah,
that threat was always with them. But even with that threat, when the 54th Massachusetts was being recruited, and Governor Andrew of the state of Massachusetts recruiting those men, and trying to keep the recruits coming from within the boundaries of the state of Massachusetts, he found a challenge trying to get the 1,000 men that he needed. So to overcome this challenge, he extended the boundaries. For wherever these men came from, he would bring them into this regiment. So former slaves from the South became a part of the regiment, and men from Canada started to come back. Now, it had to mean something to them, because they had escaped this institution.
Right.
To the point that they went to Canada to get away from the institution. For them to come back to be a part of the 54th Massachusetts, there was no doubt in their mind what this war was all about.
Right.
I mean, the Southerners were debating. I don't know. Maybe I'm adding some modern day interpretation about states' rights. The Northerners might have been debating about preserving the Union, but for those men from Canada coming back, they knew why they were in this thing. It was about slavery in their minds.
Yeah, it was high. It was just an incredible commitment. If you imagine, what I try to tell my students is, I was in the military for 4 years myself, but if you would have told me beforehand that you have a chance of, if you get captured, you're not going to be treated as a prisoner of war, I mean, that changes the whole equation. It really, really does. Well, Mr. McGill, I wonder now, when you're doing, when did you first hear about the term or the concept of Black Seminole?
I heard that when I was an employee for Penn Center.
Okay. You were at Penn Center?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was director of history and culture at Penn Center, and I interacted with Joseph Apollo, who was an avid researcher, and because of his research, He was instrumental in that documentary, Families Across the Sea. Of course, Emery Campbell was my former boss. And in Joseph Opala's research and studying the diaspora and in where Africans from the region, the rice growing region, actually ended up, and their movement once they got here, their attempts to move further south, to further remove themselves away from slavery, and using any means necessary to do that. The Stoner Rebellion, the attempts of blacks to move through South Carolina, and their movement was south. Of course, that was unsuccessful, but that's what they were trying to do, because somehow they knew, I had gotten the word that if they made it south and got to this area, they could mix with the population here and be free. The Seminole Wars and the revelation of the commander of the army making a statement that this is just as much a war with the Native Americans, being the Seminoles, as it is with the blacks that had mixed with them. So that, through that research, was my indication or my first knowledge of black Seminoles.
Okay. And was that, when you think about it, Mr. McGill, in your work in terms of the National Trust and as a historian and a person involved in public education, how widespread do you think that knowledge is today as compared maybe 10 years ago? Or is it still kind of a hidden story?
Well, I think it's a little more widespread through happenstance. And it's a happenstance. Oh, something else about the Seminoles and my experience with the Seminoles. Being a park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument, a part of that was also being a park ranger at Fort Moultrie, where Osceola is buried, and how he was thwarted or fooled or deceived into thinking that he was negotiating a settlement, a peace settlement for his people, and being captured and being held as a prisoner in Fort Moultrie and dying there of whatever he died of. And now he's buried there at Fort Moultrie. So that gave me some other knowledge of the Seminoles and their plight. But the knowledge that's, I think, kind of out there as an individual on the outside looking in, it kind of comes through happenstance and through the sports program of Florida. Is it the University of Florida?
Florida State.
Florida State,
Yeah.
excuse me. In the Seminole, Florida State Seminoles, and all the controversy around these various institutions to try to eliminate the use of Native American emblems and names and mascots. So even with that controversy and that attempt to get rid of these mascots, it encourages research, and so I've gained some knowledge through that, of the Seminoles, Chief Osceola. But again, I bring a little more to the table because I knew the Osceola story, and so generally I have some general knowledge.
Yeah, it's interesting now that the William Katz keynote, which unfortunately I missed, but years ago, the book Black Indians, I know it made a big impact, but in the West, because I grew up in the West Coast, and I didn't know how many people read the book out here, or So it was kind of interesting. I wonder if you, Mr. McGill, if you wouldn't mind going back to the slave dwelling project for a few moments, and you had told me about your first experience. Are there other experiences you had in staying overnight that stay with you, they're memorable, that you just kind of think back on and
Yeah, there are lots, but one that stands out with me. There's a gentleman. His name is Terry James, and he's a fellow reenactor like myself. And he stayed at about 10 places with me, mostly in South Carolina. But on his second stay, he brought with him 2 pairs of shackles. And he said, Joe, I'm going to sleep in these shackles tonight because, you know, our ancestors coming across in the Middle Passage in the holds of ships were very limited in their movement, and everything they had to do in that one spot, you know. So I'm going to sleep in these shackles tonight. And he said, I brought a pair for you, and if you want to experience that, you know, you're more than welcome. And I declined. I couldn't deal with that. I couldn't handle that. But I would wake up in the night, and every time he moved around, I'd hear those. I'd hear the sound of those shackles. So that was moving. Another time was a time when in Texas, Seward Plantation. After the stay, the owner said, this is early in the morning, we're about to leave. He said, I got one more thing to show you guys. And so we're walking to the vehicle. We're about to get in the vehicle. He said, you guys walk right by. You didn't see it? So we said, no. So he pointed to it, and it was an auction block.
Wow.
He said, that's an auction block. So I stood on that auction block, and the other person that was with me stood on that auction block. And that was another moving moment during the presentation. So there have been times like that.
That's intense.
Yeah.
Did you grow up with a sense of history? Was that did people tell you stories about that, or was that just something that?
No, I did not grow up with a sense of history, nor was I a good history student. The thing that moved me is when I was in the military and I went to Amsterdam, and I went to the place, to the house where Anne Frank hid out during World War II. That's what made history relevant to me. That's what made a place relevant to me, because I went in that space, and then I thought about the time in history, in my history class, where I saw that film that was shown to me in high school, and because I was there in that place, and that's what did it for me.
But you had, but as a child growing up, there was no, there wasn't as much emphasis placed on the history and. Okay.
Not Black history, certainly not Black history. A lot of the knowledge I know now about Black or African American history has come to me through my own research, my own desire to want to know more about my history, our history in general, for that matter.
If you were, and as you think about your time in the conference so far, and then the sessions and what you're teaching us about your work with the slave dwelling project, what are some lessons that you would like to turn around and kind of impart to others about what you've been doing here and learning here about this history?
Here, I think it's certainly important to know about your Fort Mose as a place, as a destination for these folks, having a place to go and be free. That's important. But they were running from something.
Right.
They were running from those places that I represent. Right. This project represents. And I think this kind of is is the other end of that story. You know, that story, although it doesn't start there, that's an important part of the story, what this project, represents. So I think, so that's why I commend the conference organizers for accepting the project, although I know it's not, as Underground Railroad themes and story goes, it does not quite fit that mold, but we managed to fit this square peg into that round hole, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's very creative of you, because it reminds me of something I read years ago, and I think it was C.L.R. James, or one of the great intellectuals from the Caribbean, and he was saying, in the colonial schools that we grew up in the British Empire, we were all black school children, and yet the first time our teachers would ever speak to us about slavery, the first word out of their mouths was Wilberforce and abolition. And and James said, well, but we never talked about the institution of slavery existing for centuries. We only started with the abolition of slavery. He said that was always kind of curious to him.
And, it's kind of like the history I learned, the South Carolina history that I learned growing up. That South Carolina history that was taught to me was all about the Confederate being right in their cause. The fact that being right in their cause did not talk about the plight of the slaves. It just talked about the Confederates being right in their cause, and in this history justifying the Confederate taking on this war that, had they won it, would have been the continuation of slavery. That's the way my South Carolina history was taught to me. And imagine a third or eighth, whatever grade I was when I learned that history. That's what I had to that was my foundation for South Carolina history. Right. And that's not good.
No. Well, how do you now, when you think about your work, and you think about the conference, and you think about a society at large, I'll just stereotype the society at large as it's fast moving, it doesn't want to think about the past, it always wants to move forward. And how do you impart that sense of history to a public which is not necessarily, history-minded? What are some of the techniques that you've learned that you can kind of bring to the table and kind of...
The technique that I learned is social media. I'm a one-person operation, if you will. Again, this is Joe McGill and his personal desire to help to do what he can to save these places. And social media is what works for me. I often have the need to talk to a lot of people at one time, and the social media does it for me.
So you blog when you don't just stay in these places, but you create a blog of each stay.
There are 35 blogs out there. There's none of the first, because of course that was years ago before this capability existed. But since 2010, every place I've stayed, there's a blog out there for it, which at some point will help compile a book. But right now, I'm riding this wave because the wave exists. And when the time comes for me to pause, to put those thoughts into book form, I'll do that.
What are the elements that go into your blog of each stay? What types of stories do you try to tell, or does it just depend on the place?
All of the above. It certainly depends on the place. The first organization that carried my blog was the National Trust for Historic Preservation, because they thought that was a beautiful idea. Let's ride this wave with them. But they limited me to 500 words, and that's okay, because it was not my idea to do a blog, and I thought 500 words would be a challenge. It was.
Be really concise, right?
And even 500 words was a challenge for me to come up with. But then when the National Trust kind of went in another direction. We got new leadership, and we were evaluating how we did business, and we had to stop doing some things we used to do. And unfortunately, this project was one of those things that got evaluated. They threw it in the pot because they were considering actually taking this thing on, more responsibility for it than they actually were doing at that time, beyond the blog, which was a good thing. I was encouraged by that, but the verdict came back. No, just as we're not doing some of the things we used to do, we're not going to do the slave dwelling project either. I said, okay, fine. But that same day, I learned that there were two other entities out there willing to pick up my blog and carry it with no restrictions on the number of words, which was good and bad. That means I had to come up with more words.
Right. Yeah.
But there were no restrictions. So now what I do with the blogs is when I invite people to stay with me and they actually take me up on it, then one of the requirements is that they have to contribute to the blog. And it's not mandatory. But some of them, they welcome that with open arms.
Do they write?
They write.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that becomes a part of the blog. They compliment what I write. Of course, I premiere, and they compliment the blog. So that's a good thing. So, but again, the social media helps.
Social media.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your you think about this? This may seem like an unusual question because I'm going to ask you to think about your own writing and your own work. What was your most memorable blog entry that you can kind of in the past? Where you feel that somehow you captured that experience and you were able to get it on the page and get it out to people.
Well, I don't know. I think the ones where people actually react. I mean, people actually comment on, and of course, initially with the newness of it, I used to get a whole lot more comments than I do now. Even with writing 500 words, because this thing was so new, it still had a lot of luster.
Right.
Folks would comment, and that was a good thing. And now the comments are less, but every now and then I still get a comment. I think now it's becoming a little monotonous to some folks, which is good and bad. That's why I always try to seek new audiences for this. That's why I'm glad I'm here at this conference, because it gives me an opportunity to gather more of an audience, to appeal to more of an audience, and that's a good thing. But getting back to the root of your question, in identifying my writing as the aha moment for me, I don't think I've gotten there yet. I don't think I've peaked yet. But I think any time I can get a response, any kind of response, whether positive or negative.
What about memorable responses?
Well, I've gotten some memorable. Man, I got a response. Well, let me give you this,
Okay.
and you gotta brace yourself for this one. And it was not anything I wrote. It was a reaction to something somebody else wrote about the project. And this is early on. One response, and again, it's in that 2%.
Okay.
One response was, if you want to get in contact with your ancestors, you need to go to the zoo and visit the ape section. Now, see, that's deep. Any thin-skinned person would have said, "Whoa, I'm not putting myself in harm's way anymore. Forget this."
Yeah.
So. Wow. But again, it was a response,
Right.
So hey, that means at least he read the article.
Yeah. Wow.
So.
Wow, that is intense. Well, Mr. McGill, again, I know you have a busy schedule at the conference. I don't want to keep you too much longer. Do you have anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to raise, or any closing thoughts, or?
Yeah. As far as the slave dwelling project is concerned, there are those places out there that some folks have in their possession and may not be aware. They may have acquired some property, and it may be labeled as a storage room or a storage area, or it might be a garage, or it might be a guest house. There are some telltale signs. Sometimes if the place has a fireplace, there's a good chance that it was a slave dwelling. Of course, now if the house was built prior to the abolition of slavery, the main house was built prior to the abolition of slavery, and there's a smaller dwelling behind it, there's a good chance it may have been a slave dwelling. But I think the most telling sign is that place had a fireplace. Okay. Even if it was the kitchen for that larger house, there's a chance that if it was more than one level, one story, it was a place also for living of slaves. So, help me find these places and help me identify those places.
Those are some of the places to look for.
Yes.
Okay. All right, Mr. McGill, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know I kept you for almost a full hour.
That long.
Right.